Have you also wasted hundreds of hours going through color grading tutorials, learning various techniques, but when you apply the same to your video, it just doesn't look as good? If that sounds like you, you're at the right place, because in this video, I'll be showing you how to take your footage from this to this using my one secret formula. So let's get started. So, before we touch a single node, let me explain what we're trying to do, because once you understand the goal, everything else clicks into place. The look we're going for is called a complementary color grade. It's built on the color wheel, and the idea is simple. Shadows get one color and highlights get the opposite color. In our case, shadows are pushed into blue and teal while highlights are kept warm. This contrast is visually pleasing to the human eye because it mimics how natural light works. The second thing that makes it cinematic is contrast and separation, specifically lifted blacks with crushed midtones, which gives that slightly faded film-like quality. Not too much. We're not going for a washed out look. We want depth in the shadows without losing details. You'll see exactly how to control this. Before we touch anything, let's talk about the node tree, because unlike the basic workflow, where we had maybe like 8 simple serial nodes, what you're looking at today is a fully fleshed out professional grade pipeline. Here's a quick overview of what each node does and why it exists. So let's start by going over my project settings. This is what I have dialed in. Make sure you're working in the time and color space of DaVinci Wide Gamut and DaVinci Intermediate, and the output is Rec 709 Gamma 2.4 or Rec 709A if you're a Mac user. So the very first thing in a pipeline is denoising, and this is a non-negotiable for advanced work. Head over to Motion Effects tab and use DaVinci's built-in noise reduction called Temporal Noise Reduction. I prefer using this for most shots, but if the noise is really heavy, I'll layer in the spatial noise reduction as well. So here's a tip number 1. Always denoise before doing any color work. If you grade first and then denoise after, you're also smearing and softening the colors you just carefully crafted. In my case, the shots that I'm trying to grade are already super sharp, shot at my camera's base ISO of 800. So I literally do not need to use any noise reduction. But if your footage has some amount of noise, you can literally fix it by these tools. Now, just like in the basics video, we need to bring our log footage into a working color space. I'm applying a color space transform effect on this node. Since this footage is shot on Sony, I'm setting the input color space to Sony S-Gamut 3.Cine and input gamma to Sony S-Log3, and the output is set to DaVinci Wide Gamut and DaVinci Intermediate. This is my creative working space. At the other end of the pipeline, node 11, which is CST out, what we're doing is basically the opposite of this, converting from DaVinci Wide Gamut back to Rec 709 Gamma 2.4, which is for delivery. Working in DaVinci Wide Gamut and Intermediate gives you enormous color volume to play with. You're not clipping colors or crushing values prematurely. Think of it as giving yourself the largest possible canvas before you start painting. Now, this is where things get a little more advanced compared to the basics video. Instead of one exposure node, I split exposure into 2 dedicated nodes. Exposure for overall exposure and highs for specifically highlights. On the exposure node, I drop the saturation to almost 0 and work in pure luminance. Just like I showed in my previous video, use the lift and gamma wheel to dial in your midtones and shadows. The key here is to not clip anything. Think of it as you're trying to grade a black and white image. Now on the highlight node, I'm using the log color wheels, specifically pulling down the highlight wheel to recover any overexposed areas and gently bring back details in the brightest parts of the image without affecting the rest of the tonal range too much. Separating highlights into their own nodes gives you surgical control, and if you're working with footage that has blown out windows or a bright sky, you can recover just the highlights without affecting anything else in the image. This is how the pros do it. Now let's move on to white balance. Enable your vector scope and make sure your neutral tones are close to the center. Use the gain and gamma color wheels for fine control, exactly how I showed before. But here's what's different at this advanced level. We're not just correcting white balance, we're making an intentional creative choice about color temperature of the image. For this particular footage, I want slightly cooler, desaturated shadows with warmer golden midtones. So I'm pushing the gamma wheel slightly towards amber while pushing the lift wheel towards blue. And also, white balance in cinematography isn't always about being technically correct. Some of the most iconic cinematic looks, think of Blade Runner, Mad Max or any Christopher Nolan film, they're built on intentionally incorrect white balance. So you should use the vector scope as a guide and not as a prison. This is something that I learned a few years ago and it helped me tremendously. Now, before we get into creative color grading, we need to build a solid contrast foundation. This is the Precon node. I'll use the custom curves here, applying a gentle S curve pulling the shadows down very slightly and lifting the highlights just a little bit. The goal at this stage is not a dramatic contrast, it's just giving the image some structure and depth before we add color. The preset node is something a lot of people skip, and it makes a huge difference. Before I start creatively pushing the colors in the next stage, I set a baseline saturation. For that, I use the color slice tab instead of the regular saturation slider under the color wheels, as I feel like it works in a very controlled manner, which I really like. And think of pre-saturation as making space. By desaturating slightly before you push your creative colors, you avoid that ugly oversaturated video look. It's the same principle as priming a canvas before you start painting. You're setting up the right conditions for the colors to behave exactly how you want them to. The mask node in my node tree is actually a compound node that contains all my power windows that I'll use for this shot. On the subject's face, I'll add a circular window feathered heavily, and I lift the gamma very slightly, just enough to make the face feel like natural center of gravity of the image. And also I'm adding some power windows around the brightest parts of the background, as you can see on the left and right, and using the gamma wheel to gently pull it down. This prevents the viewer's eye from drifting. This prevents the viewer's eye from drifting towards the bright background, away from the subject. Power windows are basically invisible VFX. No one's watching a film will ever say, "Oh, I can see the power window." They'll feel it. They'll feel naturally drawn to what you want them to look at. This is what separates a colorist from someone who just applies LUTs. So make sure to use your power windows very intentionally and carefully. Now, CST out. CST out is reverse of CST in. We set the input to DaVinci Wide Gamut and DaVinci Intermediate, and the output to Rec 709 Gamma 2.4. This brings us to a standard deliverable color space. Notice how the image looks at this point. It should already look genuinely cinematic, with good split toning and great contrast. This is already a solid grade, but we're not done. Alright, this is the moment I've been building towards. My secret formula, which is my new signature LUT, which I've been very carefully building for a few months. Right now, you already have a very beautiful grade, but when I drop my signature LUT onto this formula node, watch what happens. Do you see that? Honestly, do you see that? That extra magic, the quality of light, the richness in the colors, and that film-like texture. This is what took me months to develop and refine, and that's the difference between a random LUT and a carefully designed LUT. My signature LUT is available through the link in the description. It's something that I'm genuinely proud of.
And honestly, if you do decide to grab my LUT, you're not only leveling up your videos, but you're also supporting this channel's future. I'm just a college student trying to turn YouTube into my full-time thing, so your support genuinely means everything to me. If any of my videos have ever helped you, please consider checking out the LUT. It will help you in getting a very cinematic look in just one click, and at the same time, it helps me keep making more tutorials like this. And to everyone who's already bought it, thank you, seriously. And if you guys ever need help, just DM me on my Instagram. I'm here to help. And lastly, if you want to grab my LUTs, the link is in the description. And now, let's get back to the video.
Now here's an important reminder. When applying a LUT, always reduce its strength. I typically drop the node opacities to somewhere between like 60 to 80%. You want the LUT to complement the grade and not overpower it. Now after the LUT is applied, I do one last pass of contrast and saturation refinement. Sometimes what happens is that the LUT shifts the color slightly. Maybe the contrast gets a little heavy or the saturation pushes a bit high. In the post saturation node, I use the color slicer and the wheel to optimize the look, just like I showed in the basics video, to make precise per channel saturation adjustments. You might dial back the blues very slightly if they're overwhelming, and nudge the orange and yellow tones just a fraction to keep the skin tones healthy. Now we're into what I call the film effect stack. These 4 nodes are what take the image from digital video that looks nice to something looking like a film. So this step helps simulate the optical characteristic of cinema lenses. That beautiful, slightly imperfect softness that you don't get from modern digital sensors. To achieve this, I'll create a power window to isolate the outer area of the frame and then apply a subtle radial blur. I'll keep the blur strength fairly low so it stays natural and it looks natural. What this does is introduce a slight softness around the edges and mimicking the optical imperfections you often see in film shot on the older cinema camera and lenses. Now this is the halation node. Halation is what happens on film when light bleeds through the emulsion layers and creates a warm red-orange glow around the bright highlights and light sources. I'm personally not going to use halation for this clip because I feel like it doesn't really go well with the kind of look I'm going for. But if you guys want to use halation, just go to the effects panel and search for halation and just drop it onto this node. And also while using halation, make sure the effect is only visible around the actual light sources and bright highlights, like for example windows, lamps, sunlights or reflections. And if your whole image is glowing, you've probably gone too far. Think of it as a halo and not a fog. This is an advanced technique that most beginners never use, a dedicated skin node. After all our creative grading and our film effects and our LUT, sometimes the skin tones get pushed around and they start looking very unnatural. The skin node is there to bring them back. I'll use the qualify tool to isolate the skin tone range. DaVinci's this qualifier is excellent for this. Then I make subtle adjustments, usually just a slight pullback towards natural warmth, a small saturation reduction and occasionally a brightness nudge. The key, no pun intended, is that this node only affects the isolated skin tone range. Everything else in the image is completely unaffected. Now, always check your skin key with a reference monitor or by zooming in into the face. Toggle the node on and off and watch closely. If the difference is obvious, you're doing too much. Skin correction should be almost invisible. The goal here is for skin to look like you didn't touch it, because healthy skin is the most important thing in any image with a human face. And that's it, I think. This is the complete pipeline. So now let's do a full before and after. Here's the raw log footage coming off the camera, flat and desaturated obviously, the way log is meant to look. And here's where we are after the full color correction and color grading process. This is a very professional looking color grade. Professional color grading isn't about one single trick. It's about understanding how light, contrast and color, they all work together to tell a story. And now you know the exact process behind it, so you can take your own footage and turn it into something truly cinematic and professional looking.